Who gave her that junk? The laughter rolled across the runway before Captain Emma Carter even reached the aircraft. It was just after 6 in the morning at Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, and the first rays of sunlight were reflecting off a line of pristine fighter jets parked near the main hangars. Their polished surfaces gleamed like mirrors. Ground crews moved efficiently between them, carrying equipment, checking systems, and preparing for another day of flight operations. A cluster of pilots stood nearby holding coffee cups and trading stories from previous missions. Then Emma appeared at the far end of the flight line, and every conversation seemed to shift in her direction. Walking with calm, deliberate steps, she headed toward the oldest aircraft on the entire base. The machine looked completely out of place among the modern fighters surrounding it. Its paint appeared faded. The body carried signs of years of use. Several maintenance panels showed slight discoloration from repeated servicing. To the casual observer, it looked less like an operational military aircraft and more like something that belonged in a museum. "That thing still flies?" one lieutenant asked, drawing a round of chuckles from the group. "I heard they pulled it out of storage just for her," another pilot added. "Maybe someone upstairs finally ran out of real planes." More laughter followed. Emma heard every word. She always did. But her expression never changed. She simply continued walking until she reached the aircraft. While the others focused on appearances, Emma focused on details. Her eyes moved carefully across the airframe. She inspected each section with quiet concentration. Every movement suggested familiarity, confidence, respect. It was the kind of behavior experienced pilots reserved for aircraft they knew better than themselves. Yet that only deepened the mystery. Across the base, rumors had been circulating for weeks. Nobody understood why one of the Air Force's most accomplished pilots had been assigned to such an unusual machine. Emma's record was nearly flawless. She had graduated near the top of her class. Her evaluations consistently ranked among the highest in her squadron. Even officers who rarely offered praise spoke highly of her professionalism, which made her current assignment impossible to explain. Some believed she had upset someone high in the chain of command. Others insisted she had been quietly removed from an elite program. A few even claimed the aircraft was part of a punishment assignment disguised as a routine transfer. No one knew the truth, and Emma never corrected them. She climbed the access ladder and paused briefly beside the cockpit. The aircraft sat silent beneath the morning sky. From a distance, it looked worn, ordinary, forgettable. But as Emma placed her hand against the side of the fuselage, a faint smile appeared for less than a second before disappearing again. Down on the tarmac, another burst of laughter echoed through the crowd. "I give it 10 minutes before maintenance has to tow it back," someone joked. More pilots joined in. Emma ignored them. She opened the cockpit and began her pre-flight inspection. What nobody noticed was a senior maintenance chief watching from across the runway. His eyes narrowed as he studied the aircraft's unusual markings. Markings that shouldn't have been there. Markings he had never seen on any aircraft in the entire Air Force inventory. And for the first time that morning, someone stopped laughing. Chief Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks had spent 27 years working around military aircraft, and experience had taught him one simple rule. If something looked ordinary but carried unusual markings, it was never ordinary. He stood beside a maintenance vehicle near the edge of the runway, pretending to review paperwork while keeping his eyes fixed on Emma Carter's aircraft. Around him, the laughter continued. Pilots passed by making comments about outdated technology and budget cuts. Some joked that the aircraft probably belonged in a history exhibit. Others speculated that it had been dragged out of long-term storage because someone in Washington had made a mistake. Daniel ignored every word. His attention remained on the strange symbols painted near the aircraft's rear fuselage. They were small enough that most people never noticed them. But Daniel had. Years earlier, during a temporary assignment at a highly restricted test facility in Nevada, he had seen similar markings on aircraft that officially did not exist. The memory lingered in the back of his mind as he watched Emma continue her inspection. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, or perhaps too carefully planned. Across the flight line, Lieutenant Ryan Walker leaned against a fuel truck and watched Emma from a distance. "I still do not understand it," he said to another pilot. "She could fly anything in this squadron. Why would she agree to this assignment?" The other pilot shrugged. Maybe she did not have a choice. Ryan nodded slowly. That explanation seemed reasonable, yet it did not explain Emma herself. Most pilots placed in undesirable assignments complained. Some requested transfers. Others spent months trying to work their way back into better aircraft. Emma had done none of those things. She never complained, never explained, never defended herself. That silence bothered people more than any argument ever could. Inside the cockpit, Emma methodically reviewed the instrument panel. The displays remained dark for the moment, but she knew every switch, every indicator, and every procedure by memory. Her movements were smooth and precise. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Outside, people saw an aging aircraft. Emma saw something entirely different. She finished one checklist and moved to the next. The morning briefing was scheduled to begin in less than 30 minutes. Most of the squadron would soon gather inside the operations building to receive details about the upcoming exercise. Rumors suggested it would be the largest readiness evaluation of the year. Every pilot wanted to impress command leadership. Every pilot wanted to be noticed. Every pilot except Emma, it seemed. As she climbed down from the cockpit, a convoy of black government vehicles entered the base through a secured access road. The vehicles moved slowly toward the command area before disappearing behind several hangars. Few people paid attention. Senior officers visited military installations all the time. But Daniel Brooks noticed. He always noticed. He watched the convoy disappear and felt a growing sense of unease. The timing seemed unusual. Nearby, two maintenance technicians were discussing the aircraft. One pointed toward the wing and lowered his voice. "Did you hear what happened last week?" he asked. The other shook his head. "They say 3 separate inspection teams requested access to that aircraft. And every request was denied." The second technician frowned. "Denied by who?" The first technician glanced around before answering. "Nobody knows." A silence followed. For the first time all morning, uncertainty began replacing amusement. Questions were spreading faster than rumors now. Questions without answers. Emma secured the cockpit, gathered her flight gear, and started walking toward the operations building. Behind her, the aircraft sat motionless beneath the bright morning sky. It looked old. It looked forgotten. But as more eyes turned toward it, one thing became increasingly clear. The mystery surrounding that aircraft was growing larger than the aircraft itself. The operations building buzzed with conversation long before the official briefing began. Pilots filled the room carrying tablets, notebooks, and cups of coffee as large digital displays cycled through weather reports, flight schedules, and mission readiness statistics. Captain Emma Carter entered quietly and took a seat near the back of the room. As usual, she attracted attention without saying a single word. Several heads turned in her direction. Conversations lowered. Then the whispers started again. Lieutenant Ryan Walker sat with a group of younger pilots near the center of the room. "I heard she is flying the mystery plane during today's exercise," one of them said. Another pilot laughed. "If that thing even gets off the ground." More chuckles followed. Ryan smiled, but something about the joke felt weaker than it had earlier that morning. The rumors surrounding Emma's assignment were beginning to outweigh the entertainment value. Nobody could explain why Command continued protecting information about the aircraft. Nobody could explain the restricted access. Nobody could explain the unusual markings. And most importantly, nobody could explain Emma's confidence. At the front of the room, Major Stephen Reynolds reviewed a stack of briefing documents while waiting for senior leadership to arrive. He was known throughout the squadron as one of the most competitive officers on the base. He flew the newest fighter available and rarely missed an opportunity to remind others of it. Spotting Emma in the back row, he walked over with an amused expression. "Captain Carter," he said loudly enough for nearby pilots to hear. "I hope maintenance remembered to fuel your antique this morning." Several people laughed. Emma looked up calmly. "I believe they completed everything required." Stephen grinned. "That is good to hear. It would be unfortunate if the exercise had to stop because your aircraft needed a museum curator instead of a mechanic." This time the laughter spread across half the room. Emma simply nodded once and returned to reviewing her flight notes. The reaction caught Stephen off guard. He had expected irritation, maybe even an argument. Instead, he received nothing. That bothered him more than he cared to admit. Across the room, Chief Master Sergeant Daniel Brooks entered carrying a folder. He noticed the exchange immediately. He also noticed something else. Emma's notes were unusually thin compared to everyone else's. Most pilots spent hours reviewing mission plans before major exercises. Emma seemed perfectly comfortable with only a few pages. It was the behavior of someone who already knew more than everyone else in the room. Daniel found a seat and continued observing. Minutes later, the room began settling as officers moved toward their assigned positions. The briefing was about to begin. Then something unexpected happened. A communications specialist entered through the side door and hurried directly to Major Reynolds. The specialist whispered something into his ear. Stephen's confident expression faded almost immediately. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. The specialist nodded. Within seconds, the news spread among the leadership team. Officers exchanged confused looks. Several checked their watches. Others glanced toward the entrance. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the pilots who had spent the morning joking about Emma's aircraft sensed that something unusual was happening. Then the main doors opened. 2 Air Force security officers stepped inside and took positions along the walls. They were followed by several unfamiliar officials wearing credentials that nobody recognized. The conversations stopped completely. Every eye in the room turned toward the entrance. A moment later, a tall officer with silver stars on his shoulders walked through the doorway. General Robert Hayes had arrived hours earlier than anyone expected, and judging by the expression on his face, he was not there for a routine briefing. General Robert Hayes rarely surprised people. During his 32 years in the Air Force, he had built a reputation for precision, discipline, and predictability. That was exactly why his unexpected appearance unsettled everyone in the room. The moment he entered, every pilot stood. Conversations disappeared. Chairs shifted. Coffee cups were quietly set aside. The general acknowledged the room with a brief nod before moving toward the front. Behind him walked several officials carrying secured folders marked with authorization levels few people at Falcon Ridge Air Force Base had ever seen. Major Stephen Reynolds immediately stepped forward. "Sir, we were not expecting your arrival until this afternoon." General Hayes glanced at him briefly. That schedule changed. His voice was calm, but it carried enough authority to end further questions. Stephen stepped aside. The general approached the briefing podium and surveyed the room. His eyes moved slowly across the gathered pilots. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then his gaze stopped on Captain Emma Carter, sitting quietly near the back. Unlike everyone else, she appeared completely unsurprised by his presence. She simply met his eyes for a second before returning her attention to the briefing materials in front of her. The exchange lasted less than a moment, but Daniel Brooks noticed it immediately. So did several others. A strange feeling settled across the room. It was as though Emma and the general shared information nobody else possessed. General Hayes turned toward the display screen. "Before we begin today's exercise briefing, there will be several procedural adjustments." A few officers exchanged concerned looks. Large-scale exercises rarely changed at the last minute. The general continued. "Effective immediately, all flight operations associated with today's readiness evaluation will be conducted under revised command oversight." Murmurs began spreading across the room. Revised oversight usually meant inspections, additional scrutiny, unexpected evaluations. None of it was welcome news. Hayes raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. "Several observers from Air Force Systems Command are present today. You will extend them full cooperation." The statement generated even more confusion. Air Force Systems Command did not normally attend routine readiness exercises. Their involvement usually signaled testing programs, classified evaluations, or technology demonstrations. Ryan Walker leaned toward the pilot beside him. "This is not normal." His friend nodded. "Not even close." At the front of the room, one of the unfamiliar officials approached the main computer console and inserted a secured access device. The large display screens flickered briefly before changing to a black background. Then a single symbol appeared. Most people did not recognize it. Daniel Brooks did. The same symbol appeared on Emma's aircraft. His heartbeat quickened. He looked toward Emma. She remained perfectly calm. Across the room, Major Reynolds noticed the symbol as well. "Sir," he asked carefully, "does this adjustment have something to do with the aircraft assigned to Captain Carter?" The question instantly captured everyone's attention. General Hayes remained silent for several seconds, long enough to make the room uncomfortable. Then he answered, "You are here to focus on your assigned responsibilities, Major." The response was polite, but final. No further explanation followed. The black screen remained displayed behind him. The unfamiliar symbol seemed almost insignificant, yet it dominated everyone's thoughts. Questions multiplied with every passing minute. Why was Systems Command involved? Why had the general arrived unexpectedly? Why was a classified symbol displayed during a routine briefing? And most importantly, why did every clue somehow seem connected to Emma Carter? As the room sat suspended in uncertainty, another officer entered quietly through a side door and handed General Hayes a sealed document. The general opened it, reviewed the contents, and for the first time that morning allowed himself the faintest smile. Then he looked directly toward Emma and said, "It appears everything is finally ready." The room remained silent for several seconds after General Hayes spoke. It was not simply the statement itself that unsettled everyone. It was the way he said it. The confidence in his voice suggested that events already set in motion were approaching a critical moment. Pilots exchanged uncertain glances. Officers shifted in their seats. Even Major Stephen Reynolds appeared less certain than he had been earlier that morning. General Hayes closed the folder in front of him and stepped away from the podium. "The readiness evaluation will proceed as scheduled," he announced. "However, flight assignments have been adjusted." A display appeared on the main screen. Names and aircraft assignments filled the room. Pilots immediately searched for their own names. Ryan Walker found his assignment near the top. Major Reynolds was listed as flight lead for one of the primary formations. Then eyes moved farther down the screen. A wave of confusion followed. Captain Emma Carter's assignment stood alone. There was no formation designation, no wingman, no supporting aircraft, just her name and a call sign nobody recognized. The room began whispering again. "What kind of assignment is that?" one pilot asked quietly. "Why is she operating separately?" another wondered. General Hayes offered no explanation. Instead, he turned to one of the officials from Systems Command. The official activated another display. This time, a countdown clock appeared. 52 minutes remained until flight operations would begin. The simple timer immediately changed the atmosphere. The exercise no longer felt routine. It felt like everyone was waiting for something. Outside, crews rushed across the flight line preparing aircraft. Fuel trucks moved into position. Technicians performed final inspections. Yet the strange aircraft assigned to Emma continued attracting attention. More personnel had begun noticing the unusual markings. Some quietly took photographs before being instructed to delete them. Others attempted to look up the symbols in maintenance databases only to discover no records existed. Every answer seemed to create more questions. Inside the briefing room, Major Reynolds finally raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, if Systems Command is involved and flight assignments have been modified, the squadron deserves clarification." Several pilots nodded in agreement. Hayes studied him for a moment. "What you deserve, Major, is the opportunity to perform your assigned duties." The response ended the discussion, but it did not end the speculation. As the countdown clock continued ticking, tension slowly spread through the room. Daniel Brooks watched the reactions carefully. He had seen this kind of atmosphere before. Not during exercises, not during inspections, during demonstrations. Years ago, he had witnessed the introduction of technology that changed aviation programs overnight. The signs had been similar: restricted access, unexpected visitors, elevated security, controlled information. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Across the room, Emma remained completely focused on her documents. She never looked at the clock, never reacted to the conversations around her, never seemed concerned by the attention. Her calmness stood in sharp contrast to everyone else. That contrast only deepened the mystery. Finally, General Hayes checked his watch and addressed the room one last time. "Pilots, report to your aircraft in 30 minutes. He paused before adding a final statement. "What happens today will be remembered for a very long time." The room fell silent again. No one laughed. No one joked about old aircraft. Because for the first time all morning, even the loudest skeptics were beginning to suspect that they had misunderstood something important. 30 minutes later, Falcon Ridge Air Force Base felt completely different from the way it had at sunrise. The laughter was gone. The jokes had disappeared. In their place was a growing sense of anticipation that nobody could fully explain. Pilots walked toward their aircraft with unusual focus. Ground crews moved with quiet efficiency. Even the air seemed heavier as the countdown clock continued its steady march toward launch time. On the flight line, Captain Emma Carter arrived beside her aircraft and began preparing for departure. Several technicians assigned by Systems Command were already waiting. Their uniforms carried no squadron insignia. Their equipment cases displayed security markings rarely seen outside advanced testing programs. As Emma approached, the technicians immediately stepped aside. One handed her a secured tablet. She reviewed the information for only a few seconds before nodding once. No questions. No discussion. Everything appeared routine to her. Yet nothing about the situation felt routine to anyone watching. A short distance away, Major Stephen Reynolds stood beside his own aircraft. He pretended to focus on pre-flight preparations, but his attention kept drifting toward Emma. The more he observed, the less sense the situation made. Why would Systems Command personnel answer directly to her? Why had General Hayes personally altered flight assignments? And why did every restricted activity seem centered around a single aircraft that supposedly belonged in retirement? Nearby, Ryan Walker noticed the same thing. "Look at the security detail," he quietly said to another pilot. Two uniformed security officers had positioned themselves near Emma's aircraft. No other plane on the flight line received similar protection. The sight only fueled more speculation. Then another unexpected event occurred. A convoy emerged from behind the command hangars and drove directly onto the flight line. Every vehicle stopped near Emma's aircraft. Doors opened. Senior officers stepped out. More officials followed. Then General Hayes himself arrived. Conversations immediately stopped. No one could remember the last time a four-star general had personally walked across a runway to observe a single aircraft before a training exercise. Hayes ignored the attention. He moved directly toward Emma. Pilots across the base watched carefully, expecting a briefing or perhaps a final inspection. Instead, the general extended his hand. Emma shook it. The gesture lasted only a moment, but its significance was impossible to miss. Senior officers rarely greeted captains that way in public settings. Daniel Brooks observed the exchange from across the runway and felt his suspicions harden into certainty. Whatever was happening today had been planned for a very long time. General Hayes spoke quietly with Emma for several moments. Nobody else could hear the conversation. Then he stepped back and looked toward the gathered officers. "Prepare the observation teams," he instructed. Observation teams. The phrase spread through the crowd almost instantly. Exercises had evaluators. Inspections had reviewers. Demonstrations had observation teams. Suddenly, the pieces began aligning in ways nobody expected. Major Reynolds looked toward the aircraft once more. For the first time all day, he was no longer trying to find reasons to dismiss it. He was trying to understand it. The countdown clock reached 10 minutes. Across the runway, technicians disconnected support equipment and closed final access panels. Security personnel cleared the surrounding area. General Hayes checked his watch before addressing the officials beside him. "Once this begins," he said, "there will be no further delays." Then he turned toward the aircraft and smiled. And in that moment, everyone watching realized they were no longer waiting for a readiness exercise. They were waiting for a revelation. The final minutes of anticipation seemed to stretch longer than the entire morning. Pilots, technicians, officers, and observers stood along designated viewing areas facing the runway. Every eye remained fixed on the same aircraft. The machine that had been dismissed as outdated now sat at the center of the most heavily supervised event Falcon Ridge Air Force Base had seen in years. General Hayes stepped forward and addressed the assembled personnel through a portable communications system. His voice carried clearly across the flight line. "Many of you have spent the last several weeks forming opinions about a program you were never authorized to know existed." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted position. Hayes continued. "Some assumed this aircraft represented outdated technology. Some believed it was an administrative mistake. Others concluded it was evidence of a failed project." He paused and slowly looked across the runway. Every one of those assumptions was incorrect. The silence deepened. Major Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Ryan Walker stared at the aircraft without blinking. Even Daniel Brooks, who had suspected the truth for hours, leaned forward slightly. General Hayes raised a small remote device. Behind him, a large display screen illuminated. The symbol everyone had been questioning appeared once more. This time, words appeared beneath it. For several seconds, nobody seemed able to process what they were seeing. Then realization swept through the crowd. Several officers exchanged stunned looks. Technicians stared in disbelief. Pilots who had spent the morning laughing suddenly stood motionless. The display identified the aircraft as part of a classified strategic aviation program. Beneath the designation was a single name: Ghosthawk. The reaction was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, just complete silence. The kind of silence that appears when people realize they have been completely wrong. General Hayes allowed the moment to settle before speaking again. For 12 years, this program remained restricted to a handful of personnel within the Department of the Air Force and Systems Command. The platform was never intended for public demonstration until development objectives were fully achieved. He turned toward Emma Carter. Captain Carter became one of the first operational pilots selected for evaluation certification. More surprised expressions appeared throughout the crowd. Suddenly, Emma's assignment made sense. The restricted access, the unusual security, the classified markings. Every unanswered question now pointed to the same conclusion. She had never been assigned an obsolete aircraft. She had been trusted with one of the most closely guarded aviation projects in the country. Major Reynolds remembered every joke he had made, every sarcastic comment, every assumption. None of them felt very amusing anymore. General Hayes continued. This aircraft was designed to challenge conventional expectations, which is why appearances were never important. His gaze swept across the assembled pilots. Sometimes the most advanced technology does not announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly while others underestimate it. A few people lowered their eyes. The lesson landed harder than any formal reprimand ever could. Across the runway, Emma climbed the access ladder and entered the cockpit. The canopy closed smoothly above her. Ground crews stepped away. Systems Command personnel moved toward observation stations. Every camera on the flight line focused on the aircraft. General Hayes checked his watch one final time. Then he smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you are about to witness why Ghosthawk remained a secret for so long." The aircraft remained motionless for a few seconds after General Hayes finished speaking. Then something unusual happened. Instead of the thunderous engine startup everyone expected from a military aircraft, only a low, controlled hum spread across the runway. Pilots exchanged puzzled looks. Several instinctively glanced toward one another as if wondering whether the engines had fully activated. Inside the observation area, technicians monitored streams of data flowing across secured displays. Every system indicator showed green. Captain Emma Carter sat calmly in the cockpit, her hands moving with practiced precision across controls that very few pilots in the world had ever touched. Across the runway, Major Stephen Reynolds watched in disbelief. The aircraft looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The faded paint, the unconventional shape, the weathered exterior. Yet now every detail seemed different. What he had dismissed as age suddenly looked intentional. What he had mistaken for wear now appeared carefully designed. The aircraft began rolling toward the runway. Cameras followed every movement. Systems Command personnel observed silently. General Hayes stood with his hands behind his back, showing none of the nervous anticipation that filled everyone else. The aircraft reached the runway threshold and paused briefly. For a moment, Falcon Ridge Air Force Base became completely silent. Then Emma advanced the controls. The aircraft accelerated smoothly. There was no dramatic roar, no violent burst of noise. Instead, it moved forward with remarkable stability. Within seconds, it gathered speed and lifted cleanly into the morning sky. Several pilots immediately noticed something unusual. The climb profile did not resemble any aircraft they had ever flown. It seemed almost effortless. Ryan Walker stared upward. "That is impossible," he whispered. Beside him, another pilot simply shook his head. The aircraft continued climbing before leveling briefly above the base. Observation screens began displaying flight telemetry. Airspeed increased steadily. Altitude changed with extraordinary precision. Every maneuver appeared smooth and controlled. Then the demonstration entered its second phase. One of the system's command analysts spoke quietly into a headset. Seconds later, multiple radar displays around the observation center refreshed simultaneously. Technicians checked their screens, then checked them again. Confusion spread across the room. "Where did it go?" someone asked. The question traveled quickly through the crowd. Radar operators exchanged uncertain looks. Several systems showed empty airspace. Yet everyone standing outside could still see the aircraft overhead. General Hayes allowed the reactions to unfold without comment. The confusion only lasted a few moments before new information appeared on the displays. The aircraft was transmitting from a completely different position than observers expected. A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. The platform was demonstrating capabilities unlike anything currently operating within conventional squadrons. Major Reynolds felt his assumptions collapsing one by one. Everything he thought he knew about the aircraft had been wrong. Everything. High above the base, Emma guided the aircraft through a sequence of evaluation maneuvers. The machine responded flawlessly. Years of development, testing, and secrecy were finally being revealed. Below, observers watched in growing amazement as telemetry continued producing results that exceeded expectations. Then the aircraft performed its final demonstration pass. It appeared over the runway with perfect timing and remarkable precision. Cameras followed it. Sensors tracked it. Observers held their breath. When it completed the pass and began its return pattern, nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was making jokes. Nobody was questioning why Captain Emma Carter had been assigned to that aircraft. Because for the first time, they were seeing what General Hayes had known all along. The aircraft touched down with the same quiet confidence it had displayed throughout the demonstration. Its wheels rolled smoothly across the runway as observers remained frozen in place, watching every second of its return. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody hurried to offer opinions. The atmosphere that morning had begun with laughter and assumptions. Now it was filled with something entirely different. Respect. Captain Emma Carter guided the aircraft toward its designated parking area and brought it to a stop. Ground crews approached carefully. Systems command technicians immediately moved into position. The operation unfolded with practiced precision, as if every person involved understood the importance of the moment. Across the observation area, pilots continued staring toward the aircraft. Major Stephen Reynolds stood motionless. He replayed the entire morning in his head. Every joke, every sarcastic remark, every confident conclusion he had drawn based on appearance alone. None of it looked very impressive now. Nearby, Ryan Walker quietly shook his head. "We all thought we knew what we were looking at," he said. No one disagreed. General Hayes stepped forward as the canopy opened. Emma climbed down the access ladder with the same calm expression she had worn all day. There was no celebration in her demeanor. No attempt to enjoy the attention. No desire to prove anyone wrong. She simply completed her duties exactly as she always had. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. The crowd naturally parted as she walked across the flight line. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed her every step. The same people who had laughed when she arrived that morning now seemed unsure what to say. Daniel Brooks watched the reactions with quiet satisfaction. Experience had taught him that true professionals rarely needed to announce their value. Eventually, their work spoke loudly enough for everyone else. General Hayes met Emma near the runway. "Outstanding work, Captain," he said. Emma nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir." That was all. No dramatic speech. No explanation. Just professionalism. The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than any public ceremony could have. Hayes then turned toward the assembled personnel. "Today was never about technology alone," he said. His voice carried clearly across the gathering. It was about judgment. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Many people looked at an aircraft and saw limitations. They looked at a pilot and assumed they understood her assignment. They saw something unfamiliar and immediately decided what it must be. His words landed heavily because everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. The general paused before continuing. "The most dangerous mistake a professional can make is believing appearances tell the whole story." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. The kind that remains after an important lesson finally becomes clear. Major Reynolds slowly walked toward Emma. Several people watched, curious about what he would do. When he reached her, he stopped and stood at attention. "Captain Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology." Emma looked at him for a moment before offering a small smile. "Not necessary, Major." Reynolds nodded once. "Maybe not, but it is deserved." Around them, other pilots began approaching as well. The atmosphere continued changing. Not because of the aircraft. Not because of the classified program. Because people were recognizing something far more important. Character. Discipline. Humility. As the morning came to an end, the aircraft remained parked beneath the bright sky, surrounded by security and specialists. Yet the real story people would remember was not the machine itself. It was the lesson that arrived with it. Sometimes the quietest person on the runway carries the greatest responsibility. Sometimes the aircraft that looks oldest holds the most advanced secrets. And sometimes respect is not earned by demanding attention. It is earned by staying focused while everyone else is busy underestimating you.